Hey Colin, it's Dr. Scott. I have some feedback for you on your rhetorical analysis draft. Just a quick reminder of what I'm looking for in the revision. I'm looking for a thesis statement that's focused, that addresses the use of rhetoric in this speech, and provides a glue for how the ideas are kind of connected. And I think the way to think about that is audience. Supporting evidence. Are you using evidence from the speech and from your research to kind of back up what it is you're saying? Um, that that's going to be really important to do well on that criterion. Also looking at the quality of the research that you use and whether or not it's something that you use to just kind of for like filler, or are you actually using it to support that argument. I'm also looking at focus paragraphs, that they focus on a specific rhetorical issue or a topic, and I'm looking at the use of organization, like how organized your writing is, and making sure your ideas are placed in a location for a particular reason, and they're not just kind of randomly placed. Then you're using transitions to connect ideas. So there's a lot that I'm looking for in this assignment, and I understand that this is a draft and you're just kind of getting ideas down. I think you have a decent start in places. I think you're definitely writing about two rhetorical issues that are so appropriate for Malcolm X. Like, holy cow. I do think, though, there's a bit more thinking that needs to go into how you're talking about those rhetorical issues and the examples that you're using. So let me kind of go through and explain my feedback, and you can we can set up a time to chat, or you can uh, ask me some questions to kind of follow up and discuss your revision ideas. Um, so there's things in here that I really kind of enjoyed, and I liked this idea, this foil in philosophy at the time. I don't know if that's coming from your research or if that's a phrase that you coined. If it is from your research, you need to make sure that you cite it and note it. If it's a paraphrase, that needs to be much clearer, and I've had a few videos about that in the last few weeks. But I like that idea of the foil, that Martin Luther King is kind of like the alternative, or Malcolm X is the alternative to Martin Luther King. And that's the way a lot of folks thought at that time. Both of these men were not perceived very well by the public. And a lot of people do this kumbaya thing with Martin Luther King, but he was kind of like, at the time, a lot of people saw him the way some folks see the Black Lives Matter movement now. They thought they thought he was radical. They thought that he was going too far. They thought that he was promoting unrest in the country. Malcolm X kind of embraced that a little bit more. So really interesting kind of dynamic that you have there. You don't kind of follow up on it and talk about it much later. And I think that's something to consider, particularly with the emotional, in the paragraph about the emotional appeals. Um, One thing, he talks about people that sit in and calls them suckers for doing that, and that's relevant. I mean, he's kind of making fun of Martin Luther King in that nonviolent approach. Um, I think the big issue there's a few big issues. One, integrating research. Two, kind of clarifying your audience. Like, who is the audience or audiences that you're writing about here? You mentioned Black community. Black community is pretty diverse. It's diverse now. It was diverse back in the 1960s. There were folks that thought Martin Luther King's approach was the way to go. There were folks that thought Malcolm X's approach was the way to go. You had folks in the middle that weren't sure what to do. So this idea of the Black community, I think that needs to get explained. Like, who are you talking about? Who was he trying to persuade, and was he persuasive or not? That is not really addressed much in the body paragraphs, but I do like that you're mentioning Black community here in the introduction. I think you might explain that a little bit more. Who was he trying to persuade there in Detroit, in that target audience? But then there's other audiences that you might be able to talk about, or that you might want to talk about in your essay. I mean, one audience that you could talk about is politicians, both Republicans and Democrats. He did not. He was not a big fan of either. Democrats might have pushed more a legislative agenda that might have been more friendly towards the African American community back in the 1960s, but he was not. He disagreed that they were a force for good. He thought he thought that he had some serious complaints about them. He also had complaints about the Republican Party. So one audience might be black folks that tend to side with Democrats or that are voting for Democrats because LBJ was working on voting rights legislation and civil rights legislation back in the day. I do think when we get to the end of the paragraph, I see that you have a thesis statement here. I think you're talking about way too much. I honestly think you could have a solid paper that focuses on emotion and logic. And you need to think about why those two, there should be a reason. And I think that reason should be the audience, that he really needed that to provide a logical framework that was really going to be persuasive to this audience. And then within that logical framework, he is using emotion in ways that kind of reinforce that logic. It's like this or that logic that he's using. And then he's like, if you go that way, you're a sucker. And so he's maybe the emotion's guilt or something like that. We'll talk about that in a second. But focus on those two. This kind of stuff, all three appeals, epidectic style, the 5 canons, it's way too much. That's a book. So focus, and I think you got something with emotion and logic. All right. So I like that you say pathos plays the most important part. So that's your claim there. I think that's great. There's a pattern though that I want to urge you to take on in your essay. You do this thing where you say something as emotion or you say something as logic, and then you give an example, and then it's not really clear after that like how that is an appeal to emotion or how it's an appeal to logic. This example here, I'm not exactly sure. I don't know if I buy that that's an appeal to emotion. I don't know if I buy that this down here is an appeal to emotion either. You need to kind of explain that. So the pattern that I'm kind of really trying to get people to take on is set up a paragraph, tell us what emotion that you're going to be working with. Again, you could write a paper that's just about pathos appeals. So you use one paragraph to talk about shame and another paragraph to talk about guilt. So tell us what it is what emotion you're going to be writing about in that paragraph. Give us an example of where Malcolm X does that, and then explain how that works as an emotional appeal. Like, how is that working as guilt? How is it working as fear? How is it working as shame? Whatever emotion that you're working with, how does that example work as an emotional appeal? And then, most importantly, this is what's missing in the paper right now. How does that work to persuade that particular audience that you've identified? Just saying black folks is probably too broad. There's people in that room that were religious leaders, and these might have been folks that were maybe sympathetic to the frustration that he had, but maybe they hadn't decided that his way to go. Maybe they were folks that were kind of on the fence. The research is going to help you figure that out. So that research needs to get included in here. So that pattern is really important. What's the emotion? Give us an example. How does that example work as either guilt, shame, or whatever that emotion is? And then why is it particularly persuasive to that audience? And then using a couple examples per paragraph, it helps you, it gives you something to talk about in terms of what's similar, what's different between them, how is that emotion working in different ways. So that's kind of what needs to happen in the paragraph. Right now, I'm not sure how these appeal or how these examples are working as emotion. You're telling me that they are, but I'm not necessarily buying it just yet. The discussion here, the first quote, I'm not seeing it as, I'm not sure how that's emotion. You're kind of assuming that I'm following along that this is an emotional appeal. I'm not sure. I'm just not buying it yet. Maybe it's pride that you're talking about. I don't know. But that explanation needs to get in there. By the time we get down to the end of this paragraph, I'm kind of lost and not sure how it's working as an emotional appeal. You found an amazing quote there, or paraphrase. And so I think that kind of matters. Need to explain how it relates to the rest of the paragraph. Right now it feels like the top half of the paragraph is about emotion, and the bottom half of the paragraph is about delivery, is what it reads like to me. Okay. I like that you're kind of connecting, you're setting up the next paragraph about logic. I'm kind of missing, I'm not sure how these are working as an appeal to logic. I think the examples could be, but again, that pattern that I was talking about, name the rhetorical issue, give us an example, explain how it's that rhetorical issue, like why is this logic, and then explain why it's persuasive or not persuasive to a particular audience. You get to decide. It seems like you think that he was pretty persuasive. So you might say something like, he's really effective at using an either or kind of logic. Like, okay, that makes sense. Where does he do in the either or? Well, ballot or the bullet. It's in the damn title. But he also does this thing like, you either do this and you're standing up for yourself, or you do this and you're a sucker. So he does that either or logic, which is really kind of persuasive. When you limit people to the choices that they might have, it's really, and they buy that choice, it's really hard to kind of not see options outside of that. So yeah, I think you got something with logic. I don't know how these examples are working as logic just yet. And just like the previous paragraph, by the time I get to the end, I'm not sure how the stuff down here is an example of logic. But you're definitely writing about two rhetorical issues, Colin, that can definitely work for this assignment. Just kind of thinking through the audience issue and connecting your examples to that audience and talking about why you think that they were persuasive or not, that is really kind of where you're at. I think learning a little bit more about Malcolm X and about the black folks at that time and how they were thinking about the civil rights movement, that's going to help you out. So let me know if you need any help. Let me know if you have any questions. I think you got a decent start. You got more work to do. So reach out and let me know how I can help. All right, that's it for now.